Welcome back, Sergiu here. This is the second video in the Nikon SB-910 series, and we're going to be talking about TTL. Each video in the series covers one function. So today we are talking about TTL, but by that I mean on-camera flash, not off-camera flash. There's going to be a separate video that covers all of that off-camera stuff. Now, last time we covered its manual functionality, we listed the overall specs, we spoke about batteries, we spoke about manual flash theory, and we took pictures to demonstrate all of that stuff. So if you haven't watched it, please go to the previous video and watch that. Right, so continuing on, as I said last time, I want to learn what this speedlight does. But I couldn't find anyone that goes in depth with it, so I'm going to attempt to do that myself and see what happens. Now, obviously, if there's anything you wish to add, please feel free to share your knowledge. And one last mention before we start, this is not a scientific test by any means. It's just me reading out these TTL specs as they're listed in a manual and as I've learned from various informative websites, and then testing them out from a user's perspective. So I'm gonna assume, however, that you do understand what I'm saying here, because this video is not a tutorial, even though it sounds like one here and there. Please remember, I'm not a professional by any means, but I do collect a lot of information, and I'm gonna be sharing that with you today. Now let me read out what I've learned about TTL and how it applies to the 910. The SB-910 Speedlight is part of Nikon's Creative Lighting System, or CLS, and uses iTTL technology, which is the third generation of TTL flash metering from Nikon. And for convenience, from now on, whenever I say TTL, I am actually referring to iTTL. Backwards compatibility with older cameras is limited, and in many cases not possible. So if you're shooting with an older camera that does not use iTTL, this is not the speedlight for you. So look up the previous generations of TTL systems. I used the older Nikon D800 for this demonstration. The D800 uses a bunch of separate systems for ambient and speedlight exposure. Today we're not covering the off-camera flash, but rather the on-camera TTL flash, and for wired TTL or hot shoe speedlight exposure, it uses TTL and Ttl-BL, both of which are supported by the 910. And for the ambient light exposure, it uses spot metering, center weighted, and 3D color matrix metering. Before we look at TTL and Ttl-BL specs, let's quickly go over what the ambient light metering systems do, because this will matter later on. So spot metering exposes for mid-gray and meters off the center focus point area of the frame if auto area is used for the AF, or it meters of a spot around the focal point if you choose to select your own focal point. If the user is able to identify tone correctly, the spot meter then allows them to read from whichever reflection in the frame resembles the tone that meets their creative vision. The center weighted meter also exposes for mid-gray but looks at the entire frame. However, the actual area of the frame that is mostly influencing the meter is a fixed user scalable circular area at the middle of the frame. If the user wishes to use the entire frame for averaging, many Nikon cameras will allow them to do so. The 3D color matrix meter, on the other hand, is heavily automated. Similar to the center weighted meter, the matrix meter looks at the entire frame. However, it does so in sections, comparing the tone distribution, highlights via exposure algorithms, and RGB color values across all sections, but also includes focal distance in 3D space if the lens can communicate that, and it extracts a result of a certain range, which is then compared against a database of real-life exposure data in order to approximate for a natural looking exposure of the ambient light. If you're interested in learning in depth about the matrix meter, start by studying the documentation on the Automatic Multi-Pattern Metering System, or AMP, introduced by Nikon back in the 80s. Now that we know what the camera's ambient light metering systems do, let's talk about speedlight metering systems. Let's start with TTL. TTL speedlight metering is a fully independent meter, which uses monitor flashes that are fired, bounced around, and returned through the lens for metering right before the mirror is raised. The monitor flash can be fired for a measurement separately with FV lock, which will take a measurement and then lock the flash exposure to the result. In the same fashion, auto exposure can be locked. The main flash is adjusted based on the reading. The monitor flashes are mostly meant to be bounced off of the objects framed within the metering area of the frame. If the system can get a correct reading, it will then adjust the resulting flash exposure in such a way that the reflection values of the objects within the metering area will equal midtone. TTL metering for speedlight works in the same fashion center-weighted metering works for ambient light. The metering area for TTL is marked by the rectangle surrounding the AF brackets in the viewfinder, and similarly to center-weighted metering, AF points do not affect flash exposure. The TTL meter for flash ignores the level of ambient light and records more and more of it on top of the flash as you dial it in. However, when matrix metering is used, the matrix meter is aware of when the flash is being used, so it will compensate by adjusting the ambient exposure if the user chooses to mix the flash and the ambient. TTL flash exposure metering results are most accurate when careful isolation of the subject within the metering area is possible, in order for the reflected light from the monitor flash to best represent the subjects and not the surrounding. This is mostly due to the ray tracing between the speedlight, subject, and lens. If, for example, too much of the metering area is taken by the background, the averaging to midtone will be biased by a heavy loss of the monitor flash as it is being absorbed by the background, thus causing overexposure. Unfortunately, this is how most real-life situations are, so photographers tend to use the flash compensation or light meter, which makes things significantly easier as it measures for incident light rather than reflected light. Reflected light can be influenced by an object's surface roughness, color, materials, and so forth, and may cause the built-in meter, which only measures reflected light, to misinterpret an object's natural look. Now let's talk about Ttl-BL. I am using the user manual for the most part, as well as some research and testing that I have done to identify the specs the best I could. Ttl-BL, aka TTL balance fill or TTL backlit, is also heavily automated and joins forces with the matrix meter to create a natural looking flash exposure of the subject, both as a main flash and as a fill flash, depending on the ambient exposure settings. It does this in two ways. The first way, if non-CPU lenses are used, it compares the reading from the monitor flashes against exposure range information from the matrix system and fires the main flash in order to attempt to obtain a natural looking lighting for the subjects within the metering area. Nikon doesn't explain whether the matrix system also takes a reading from the monitor flashes, but they do tell us that the matrix system is providing Ttl-BL with exposure range information in order for Ttl-BL to be able to create a natural look for the subjects. The monitor flashes are extremely important here, and much like TTL, the better the subject framing, the better the results, only you're gonna end up with a natural looking subject rather than an average to grey. But if a CPU lens is used, then it can tell the Ttl-BL system how far away it focused. The Ttl-BL system then once again attempts to obtain a natural looking lighting within the metering area by working together with the matrix system, but also uses the distance information from the lens to match the main flash exposure to guide number. I must mention that distance is also taken into account when using bounce flash as well, at least with my system, but is not taken into account when using FV-lock, as FV-lock is meant to be used for recomposing. Ttl-BL is meant to be used with the CPU lens, which is what most people do anyway. The Ttl-BL system is also using the metering area marked by the rectangle surrounding the AF point brackets, just like TTL, and is not influenced by the position of the focus points, but rather by focusing distance. So moving the focus points around will not do anything, but actually refocusing the camera will. It is important for the background to be framed correctly within the frame, so that both Ttl-BL and whichever meter is being used for ambient can get a correct reading for themselves. Because Ttl-BL works as a main flash while the ambient is under 0 EV and as a fill flash when the ambient is above 0 EV. When in main flash mode, there will be no visible change to output. However, once the user dials in 0 EV on the ambient, Ttl-BL will automatically lower flash output based on how much above 0 the ambient is. The SB-910 supports both Ttl-BL and TTL, and is one of the very few speedlights that will allow the user to select between the two. Ttl-BL is automatically disabled when spot metering for ambient is being used, because spot metering works in a fundamentally different way and would most probably not expose the ambient correctly, especially in bright ambient light. When spot metering is used, the camera will use TTL for flash exposure instead. And lastly, it is very important to understand which metering area is being used for what when composing. All the metering systems use a certain area, and in some it can be changed or weighted. This applies to all cameras, however. The exact areas in the frame may differ between cameras and lenses. Always check the manual for more information on this matter. I tested out the TTL specs, and for that I needed to take pictures. I will list the D800's metering areas as they are listed in the manual in order for you to understand why I've been framing things the way I did. The matrix meter is looking at the entire frame in sections. It also weights its metering around the focus point, but make no mistake, the entire frame is taken into account. The spot meter uses a 4mm spot which has roughly the same area as a focus point. When auto area focusing is used, it will meter from the focus point within the center of the frame, but when you select the focus points, it will meter off the selected focus points instead. Center weighted also looks at the entire frame, but does most of its averaging from a user selectable circular area within the center of the frame, and then tapers off towards the edges. So when it's doing its mid-tone averaging, it will work mostly within the center area and much less towards the edges of the frame. My center area is set to 12mm. You may alter the size of this area to fit your needs, but check the manual to see by how much, or if you can. The TTL flash exposure meter is using the area that is marked by the rectangle surrounding the AF point brackets, but is unaffected by the position of the focus point. It just uses that area to do its monitor flash based calculations. Ttl-BL also uses the same area. Also, FV-lock metering area is a 6mm circle in the middle of the frame for both TTLs. Well, so that's the specs and what I've learned about TTL so far. I run some tests to see how and if that stuff applies in practice, and whether the 910 is up for it. Now, unlike last time, I already took all the pictures in order to save time. I'll run you through the test result, but first let me show you what I used for the test. Now, I have the D800, as I said, and I used it with an AFS Nikkor 78300 4556 GVR, which is right here, and the 910 in the hot shoe, which is as you can see now. I got a tiny 50mm nifty 50 lens on there at the moment. Now I have a HDMI cable which runs from the camera into the PC just like last time, so that you can see the pictures. And my subjects are a couple of blank pieces of paper, one of which has a brighter tone and the other one has a darker tone, and they're both next to each other. Now I'm looking for tone comparisons alone, so for the test I've shot everything in black and white, and the blank papers should give us a clear reading of the tone since they are clear and flat surfaces and they have the same surface roughness. I just want to see if the TTL systems do what they say they do, so I've set up for a clear reading. I also have a light absorbing background in order for it to be able to absorb some of that monitor flash when I point the metering area at it, but at the same time I have a bright enough light in order to brighten it up when I need to dial in some ambient light. Oh, and by the way, I don't have a non-CPU lens, so I had to improvise for the sake of the testing and I built one. I just taped together a lens basically. That you just don't do this at home, okay? Don't. But it worked well enough for the test. Anyway, so yeah, let's have a look at the back of the 910 now and how to access the TTL modes. Now, actually accessing the TTL mode is quite easy. Just like all the other modes, you press the mode button and then you scroll all the way through until you see rather TTL or TTL-BL. Now, scrolling one step forward or backwards should allow you to see both of them. If you cannot see TTL-BL, remember that's because you have to be in rather matrix or center weighted metering modes. It will not work with spot metering. The screen basically just shows you all of your exposure values as you dial them in on the camera as they're being sent to the speedlight. Other than that, if your speedlight is facing forward, then you can see this number here on the screen, which shows you the distance between, well, the effective distance, so you can have your subject anywhere within that distance and you'll be fine. If you're bouncing, obviously that disappears, but it can still be useful to kind of eyeball distances. As far as the function buttons are concerned, the zoom button does exactly what it does in all the other modes. So press zoom, introduce your own zoom, reset back to the lens, press again. You can change your illumination patterns with the third function button. Now going back to the main screen, the second function button is your flash compensation, so you can compensate 3 of these up and down. And the test fire button, really all it does, it just kind of tests the speed light. So it uses a power that's preset in the menu and then tests it out. But it's not actual testing like you do with the other modes, it's just kind of firing. You can change the power by going into the menu and looking for the flash test button tab, and then you have 3 powers here from to choose from. There's really not any other menu related items to TTL apart from FX DX. This allows you to select between your FX and DX lenses, or you can choose the first option there, which selects automatically if you're switching between FX and DX lenses for some reason. That's about it as far as the menu goes. There is one more thing though. Going back to the main page, as you can see here, the third function button doesn't really show anything. And that's because there's a warning function built into the speedlight. For example, if you can't get a reading, or if it fired and it underexposed because it fired at full power and it wasn't enough, or because it misfired. So you can, for example, if you cover the lens with your hand and then take a reading, look what happens to the third button there. See that? And also your test fire button flashed, and so did your flash indicator inside the viewfinder. That's because it's flashing at you that there's a problem with rather the exposure or the reading. So, but then you're gonna go, okay, there's a problem, but what problem? You know, how much? So that's where the third button comes into play now. So if you press that, it'll actually tell you by how much it will underexpose or underexposed if it fired already. But obviously I covered the lens, so it'll be maxed out. But really, that's all there is to it. You got your temp indicator there, and pretty much that's it really as far as the actual TTL screen is concerned. Now let's have a look at the test results. As I said, I took some pictures, and they're all in the camera. I'm going to show you as we go through. So I tested out all the claims in the specs basically. So let's start out with TTL. Now, the main idea that I'm able to extract from the info provided by Nikon and Nikon users so far is that TTL solves for middle gray by means of the sum of the reflections of the objects framed within the metering area averaging to mid-tone, given that the monitor flash reads correctly. So pretty much exactly like center-weighted metering. So for the first test, I used the high shutter speed in order to dial out the ambient light. I framed the bright piece of paper within the metering area in order to optically isolate the reflections from it, so that the TTL gets a correct reading. I took a picture, and then I took some more pictures as I slowly shifted the camera towards the darker paper. So the papers are blank and single toned all across, so I should get a mid-gray looking paper in the first picture, even though it is much brighter, and then it should brighten up as I gradually shift the camera towards the darker paper. So when each of them, for example, when each of them is taking half of the metering area, they should be equally as far away from mid-gray on the histogram in order for the sum of their reflections to equal mid-tone. So let's have a look then. So that's the first picture, which is mid-gray as they said. So, and it's covering the entire metering area, and remember the metering area is basically just surrounding the AF point brackets there. So imagine that basically. It doesn't show you on the screen, but that's where it is. Now next picture up. We're slowly, as I said, we're slowly shifting towards the darker toned paper, and we can see it coming through. This is halfway through, and if you check the histogram, you can see that they're actually nearly equally as far apart, which makes sense. Next up, we got the darker paper is brightening up as expected because it's trying to turn that into mid-gray. And then the last picture, now the dark paper is mid-gray. So that tested out about right. Now for the second test, since this is pretty much exactly what center-weighted metering does, let's compare it against center-weighted metering with ambient light. So we should see exactly the same thing. I used the white lamp, but that had a reflector around it, which mimics the speedlight. So yeah, let's have a look. So this is center-weighted, as you can see here. We're not using flash. The bright paper looks mid-gray, which is exactly what we expected. And as we're slowly shifting towards the gray paper, you can see that it's brightening up exactly like the flash. So this is halfway through. They're roughly halfway from the mid of the histogram there. And the last picture is dead on mid-gray. So that was the second test, which turned out to be about right. But what happens when the camera doesn't get a good enough reading of the object? You know, like in a real life situation where the subject isn't a perfectly flat single toned area fully covering the metering area and shooting that monitor flash right back through the lens, you know. So what I did for the third test was to use the bright paper as the main subject. However, this time I shifted the camera towards the background instead. So gradually more and more metering area was covered by a light absorbing background, which absorbed a lot of that monitor flash, so causing the difference of lighting to be quite high. Now let's see what that meant for the subject here. So we got the mid-tone, we got the white paper there, which looks mid-tone gray, which is what we expect because it's covering the whole area. And now if we're moving towards the background, now we've got 25% background. You can see it's already brightening up a tiny bit. Now we've got 50% background, which is made the paper, it's basically one stop above where it was, which is quite a lot actually, and that's only half the background. Now 75% of the background overexposed the paper, and 100% of the background, well, that obliterated the poor paper completely, so because it's trying to turn the background into mid-gray. So that looked about right. Now for the last test I dialed in ambient light. Now it says in the specs that TTL doesn't care much about ambient light, so that means that the more I dial in, the more the flash should just add up on top of the ambient light. So that's exactly what I've done. So let's have a look. So I used the gray paper as the main subject this time, so that we can see the difference. You can see the background in the back. We're at 1/60th now, using flash of course. Now I dialed some of that background in, so we're at 1/30th. You can see it brightening up tiny bit there. 1/15, that's quite a lot already. 1/8, that's pretty much overexposed by now. 1/4 is completely blown. So yeah. Also, I'm guessing that that's also true. So yeah. Well, you know, since TTL is depending so much on that monitor flash, you really need to isolate the reflections you want to work with the best you can. So the workflow is similar to center-weighted metering, which is why I made that comparison in the first place, because it's, as I said, it's exactly the same thing. And I kind of like that. It kind of makes more sense to me as a user to meter for a certain tone on the subject and then you know, lock and recompose. You do need to keep in mind that the you know, how the light travels from the flash to the subject and then back through the lens, especially when you're using bouncing or a mod. If you're getting an incorrect reading, the system will overexpose. So you know, or underexposed if it doesn't, you know, if it's bouncing around, you know, like back and then forth, and then you got a lot of space behind you, for example, it's just gonna get absorbed in the space. So anyway, now I understand why you know, a lot of people use flash compensation with TTL. Anyway, let's have a look at Ttl-BL. Now, I changed the order of the tests since Nikon warns us that the system behaves differently with non-CPU lens. So we're gonna do CPU lens first, because basically everybody uses CPU lens, so chances are you're gonna experience the exact same thing. Now, the specs are saying that my subjects will look natural if the system can get a correct reading within the metering area due to the data from the matrix system. So that means that if I fill my metering area with the subject, in this case the bright tone paper, and I take a shot, it should look natural, not mid-gray. And I also want to test for a few other things. I did use the CPU lens, which means that the system also locked the flash exposure across distance. So then if I focus the camera behind the subject, it should fire brighter since it's trying to reach further for both direct flash and bounce flash. And also, if I point the metering area at the background, I should not see that much of a difference, because the system is trying to give me a natural look across the metering area, but at that distance. So it shouldn't fire like crazy. So let's have a look at what came of that. So as you can see here, this is the first picture that I took. I framed the white paper within the metering area and it looks white. So this is TTL-BL, remember, as expected. And then I focused way behind the paper and it fired brighter, exactly like we expected. Now I tried the same thing with bouncing flash, and while using bouncing flash I found that it underexposed it. And then, but at the same time, if I focus behind the paper, once again it fired brighter, just to demonstrate that it works with bounce flash as well, because you might read on online that it doesn't, but it, as you can see here, it obviously does. The other thing that I tried was to frame some of the background within the metering area, and then it exposed a bit better with bounce. The other thing I said I want to try is what happens when I'm doing the same thing I did with TTL, pointing towards the background. So now what I'm expecting to happen basically is that I'm expecting it to not overexpose the paper. It's already white, like it should. So if I'm switching, if I'm slowly turning towards the background now, you can see what happens. It's brightening up, which is to be expected, and a bit more. It's brightening up even more now. And let's see, have a look at this. Now, this is 75% background. Now, remember what TTL did here. It basically just stuck all those pixels basically to the right. And now if I do 100% background, as you can see, there's no difference. So that means that it is locked across distance. And it is absolutely great. I like that. So that looks about right, I would say. Now let's see what it does to the tone of the two pieces of paper. Now one is brighter, the other one is darker, which means that no matter which one is where across the metering area, as long as I can take a reading correctly, they should look exactly the same, right? Because that's what the matrix system is telling you to do. So I tried exactly that. So I framed this one, I framed the white paper, as you can see here, within the metering area, and then slowly shifted towards the darker one, and there's no changes. I also tried to zoom out and see how it behaves if it's seeing some of that background, and I tried exactly the same thing, and it also behaves quite well actually. It's about the same result. Now that also looked pretty good. I'm quite impressed actually. Now for the next test, I dialed in some ambient light, and remember that remember from the shutter speeds that we were using it as a main field flash, as a key light, so main flash. However, the spec is saying that once I dial in the ambient at 0 EV, the flash will immediately reduce power and turn from main flash to field flash. Obviously, I'm using the camera in manual mode, so I can show you this. So I tried exactly that. So I shot. So I assigned half of the background to the half of the metering area to the background, to that shirt in the background, and half to the paper there. We are at 1/250th of a second, as you can see here, and I'm slowly gonna dial in the ambient light. Now we are at 1/25th, 1/60th, and the flash is obviously lighting the paper. So as you can see there, there's 1/250th, 1/25th. There's no changes yet. 1/60th, and bam, 1/30th. This is where we reached 0 EV on the ambient. So as you can see here, there's a clear difference there. It stepped down, and then from there on, it just gets less and less bright as you dial in more ambient. Now I can show you an even better example of this, because I took some pictures the other day. Basically, what you can see here is we got bright sunlight to the right and flash to the left. So the flash is lighting the wall, and we got bright sunlight to the right, and the most of the metering area is covered with that pipe there. So we're at 1/250th of a second at f22 this time, just so that we can dial out a lot of that ambient light. And then we're using matrix metering now. So let's dial in the ambient light. So 1/250th there, 1/25th. You can see that it's brightening up, but nothing's changed yet. 1/60th. Nothing's changed yet because we haven't reached 0 EV. 1/30th, once again, nothing's changed, but now you can see that the ambient light there is quite bright. And boom, 1/15th. This is where we reach 0 EV. So from here on, see that? The more ambient you dial in, the more the flash will step back so that it can make room for the ambient. So this is a great feature actually to have. So anyway, this is the same test again, but with center weighted metering. So as you can see there, we're using center weighted metering now. 1/250th, again the same thing. 1/25th, there's nothing there. 1/60th, we got nothing. But you can see now that the ambient is brightening up. 1/30th, and then once again we reach 0 EV on the ambient. Boom! It's stepping back, and even more at 1/8. But there is one more thing that I want to show you that I noticed. So now if I go back to the papers here, yeah, that's good. Now look what happened when I metered, when I framed the paper within the metering area and I covered it completely. So as I'm bringing up the background, the ambient, nothing's happening. See, it's just adding up. Now obviously it looks fine because it's supposed to look natural, but still that's one thing to keep in mind. Make sure that the background is actually seen within the metering area of the of the TTL-BL flash metering area. And now for the last test, what happens if you're not using a CPU lens? Now Nikon warns us that in the manual that if you're not using a CPU lens, and that changes everything. So obviously distance information is out of the equation, but even then I got some interesting results. And remember, this is where I use the made up lens, because I don't have another one. So now basically if the subject is within the metering area, it seems to underexpose, and then that keeps happening across the entire area. But at the moment the subject makes it out of the metering area, then you're pointing at the background entirely. Boom! And let me show you what happens. So subject, as I said, is within the metering area. So as I'm shifting towards the background, nothing is happening. Still nothing's happening. And then all of a sudden, once you made it out, see that? It's somehow able to tell from the reflections that there's a subject there, right? See? And then I tried with many different subjects and with different shapes and colors, and the same thing happened all the time. And then just for comparison, I tried TTL. This is TTL now, and look what happens here. See that? I tried multiple times just to confirm. TTL seems to not be affected by it. TTL just does its thing, like it normally does. So the only conclusion that I can come up with is that it's rather, it rather wasn't taking a correct reading from my made up lens. But even then, why did TTL work? Because if it wasn't taking a correct reading, then TTL shouldn't have worked either, but it did. So I mean, honestly, I think that, and I tried multiple times just to confirm, but I think it's only supposed to work as a field flash if you're not using a CPU lens. That's the only thing that the only thing that makes sense to me. And indeed, dialing in the ambient light doesn't change anything. And then if a subject is further away in the background but still within the metering area, it will fire brighter because it's looking at the background pretty much, which is why it fire brighter when I frame the background within the metering area. But anyway, take this with a grain of salt, because I don't have I don't have a non-CPU lens. So, but if you do have a non-CPU lens, please let me know in the comments if you're using this with a non-CPU lens. Please let me know what your results are, because I'm really curious on that matter. But anyway, that's all for the test today. I mean, the 910 seems to be doing what it says on the tin. I mean, apart from the non-CPU lenses, where I'm not too sure. I think Ttl-BL is a mode that's probably best used by people who just wanna fire the flash and take a picture. Much like Matrix is for ambient. It will give you natural looks and and the field flash, which makes sense since you want the flash to match the ambient when you use field flash. So so this is what I can conclude so far from my tests and what I've learned about the two TTL systems. Now, first let's talk about TTL. Now, technically, the TTL system doesn't have limitations. As you saw, it does exactly what it's supposed to do. I mean, different objects reflect different amount of lights, and when they say they are, when they are combined, the amount of light reflected also changes predictably, so the system knows how bright to fire. But it depends mostly on the monitor flash, and the Speedlight, is a small and mobile source. And you need to do your best to frame the reflections you want to work with within the within the metering area. If, for example, half of the metering area is receiving light from an object that reflects well enough for a reading but has a darker tone, and then the other half is looking at the background, which absorbs most of the monitor flash, then the object will most probably be above mid-tone. I mean, let alone its actual tone, because a whole lot of that monitor flash has been lost. Now, a lighter tone subject that has the same reflectivity might look correct, but that's just because it's lighter, not because the exposure is actually correct. And similar things may happen if a subject is human and their clothes are absorbing too much monitor flash. I mean, it's pretty much like center-weighted metering, only you can you can't see it because it's too fast, So basically you have to fill the metering area with such tones that when summed together, their average equals middle gray, but also represent the tones that will give you the exposure you're going for. If he gets it wrong, then it's because it's not looking at the, if he gets it wrong, then it's basically because it's looking at the wrong reflections, It's, that's pretty much the way to sum it up. And, it's okay because that's real life. You can't really frame all, you can't always frame it all perfectly, so you have to, that's what flash compensation is for, essentially. But there are things you can do to ensure that it's looking at the correct light, such as zooming in order to optically isolate the light it should be reading. And no, zooming in doesn't affect the reading, in fact it helps it, because of how lenses maintain brightness over unit area. And we spoke about this last time. And FV-Lock only uses a 6mm dot at the center of the frame to do its metering, at least in my camera. I mean, check your manual to see if it's the same. But that improves accuracy because TTL metering area is much larger. Now TTL for flash doesn't do spot metering obviously, but it's FV-Lock comes close essentially. So besides you can then you can recompose as you wish. Now I guess center-weighted users feel right at home with TTL flash, since it's again it's pretty much doing exactly the same job only with flash. Let's conclude Ttl-BL. I don't know how to feel about it. It's influenced by a bunch of factors, but still the monitor flashes are hugely important. I mean, you can try FV-locking with your while blocking the lens with your hand, and then taking a picture and just watch it destroy everything. It is, however, locked across distance, that it works in 3 dimensions rather than 2. It also talks to the matrix system, asking it how bright to fire in order to obtain natural exposure within the metering area. If your lens actually tells it the distance is focused at, then it won't fire any brighter than it needs to be at that distance. And in order to obtain natural exposure of the things it's looking at. Now, I don't have an actual non-CPU lens, but I have been able to repeat the test with multiple subjects while using my improvised one, and every time the moment it saw something is aggressively underexposed, which to me screams field flash. Now I understand that it's supposed to be used as a field flash, it's advertised as a field flash, and I can understand the behavior. I just don't know if I got it right with my made up lens. But I have been able to repeat those tests with, as I said. And as you saw, TTL worked with this. So that means that, I mean, once again, if you have one of those non-CPU lenses, if you've used Ttl-BL with it, then please let me know what your results are, because I really am very curious on that one. Now, it's... The thing is, if you have a CPU lens, I mean, it's 2 separate systems in one. It's a field flash and it's a main, main key flash. It works as a main flash with a flavor for natural exposure if you have a CPU lens, which everybody does really, And once you've dialed in 0 EV on the ambient, then Ttl-BL stops down the flash based on how much ambient you've dialed in above 0 EV, and it automatically engages field flash. And if you're taking a reading with FV-Lock, for example, then it goes for mid-gray, just like TTL. By the way, I tried that, at least on my camera, and it ignores the lens. FV-Lock does ignore the lens, so I I don't know, it makes for a great field flash when you're in a big room, for example. Well, makes for a great main flash when you're in a big room and you're taking a picture of things close to a wall, for example. But it will light up the room. But when your subject is closer than the walls and the room is large, then it will fire dimmer and you're gonna have a dark room. In which case, I think TTL will actually do a better job for this kind of work. You can tell it engaged in field flash when you're shooting, through your viewfinder, for example, as your recycle times will shorten all of a sudden, especially when you're shooting with, at the low ISO and the closed aperture in a bright daylight. And you can see that all of a sudden it's, it's recharging a lot faster, and then it's in actual field mode. But honestly, I don't like this, I don't like it because why can't I have the button that switches between field flash and key light? And besides, it's limited to whatever the matrix system tells it to do as far as your looks are concerned. So, which is fine if you want a natural look, but then what if you don't? You can be much more creative with TTL or just plain old manual. I think, and I what if you're using a mod, for example? I think TTL-BL is for like, as I said, shooting random photos at a party or something like that. It's more complex, more automated, but all this automation is kind of limiting, It's I've not used any of the newer systems though. I'm wondering what those are like. Yeah, I mean, anyway, that's it for today. I took many photos in order to confirm all of my tests, and again and again. And I think the Nikon SB-910 is a great performer for the price. Next time we're going to be looking at non-TTL auto flash, which is actually easier to work with and easier to explain. TTL, it's not that complicated either. It's just that you need to work with it. You need to work with it a lot to get used to what it does. But I still prefer manual flash. If you ask me, I prefer manual flash all the way. Manual mode, GN mode. Yeah, manual flash, manual I mean, manual flash, aperture priority maybe, and yeah. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time when we talk about non-TTL auto flash. Bye bye. The matrix meter is aware of when the flash is being used, so it will compensate by adjusting the ambient explode. If the user wishes to the monitor flash can be fired for measurement separately. The monitor flash can be fired for a measurement separate. The monitor flash can be fired for a measurement separately via. The monitor flash can be fired for a measurement separately with FV lock